In the palm of your hand lies a device that connects you to the entire world, your smartphone. But hidden within its sleek design is a metal that tells one of the most troubling stories of our digital age. Cobalt, a crucial component in the lithium-ion batteries that power not just our phones but also laptops, electric vehicles, and countless other modern technologies, comes primarily from one place: the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC produces approximately 70% of the world's cobalt, making it indispensable to the global technology industry. In 2024, the DRC's production is projected to reach 244 kilotons, a 38.9% increase, driven by the ramp-up of operations at the Kisanfu mine and Tenke Fungurume mine. This mineral wealth should be a blessing for one of Africa's poorest nations, but instead, it has become the foundation of a supply chain marked by exploitation, environmental destruction, and human rights abuses. Behind every electric vehicle heralded as the future of sustainable transportation, behind every renewable energy battery storage system designed to combat climate change, lies a darker reality playing out in the cobalt mines of southeastern DRC. This is not just a story about mining or technology. It is a story about the hidden human cost of our connected world and the moral contradictions embedded in our pursuit of a greener future. The geography of cobalt. Understanding the Katanga province. The story of Congolese cobalt begins in the southeastern provinces of Haut-Katanga and Lualaba, collectively part of what was historically known as the Katanga province. This region sits atop one of the world's richest mineral deposits, formed over many years through geological processes that concentrated copper and cobalt ores in easily accessible surface deposits. The abundance of these minerals is both a geological marvel and a historical tragedy. The same deposits that make the DRC crucial to the global economy have also made it a target for foreign exploitation for over a century. During the colonial period, Belgian companies extracted vast wealth from these mines while providing minimal benefits to local populations. Today, Chinese companies have largely taken over this role, controlling much of the industrial mining infrastructure, while thousands of Congolese work in dangerous artisanal mines. The region's mining landscape is divided between large-scale industrial operations run by multinational corporations and small-scale artisanal mining sites, where individuals and families dig for cobalt with basic tools. Of the 255,000 Congolese mining for cobalt, 40,000 are children, some as young as 6 years. These artisanal miners, known locally as cruisers, work under conditions that would be unthinkable in developed countries, earning less than $2 per day while risking their lives in unstable tunnels and toxic environments. The contrast between the region's mineral wealth and its human development indicators is stark. Despite sitting on resources worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the southeastern DRC remains one of the poorest regions in the world. Infrastructure is limited, healthcare systems are inadequate, and educational opportunities are scarce. This poverty drives families to send their children into the mines, creating a cycle of exploitation that has proven difficult to break. The scale of child labor, a statistical portrait of exploitation. The statistics surrounding child labor in DRC's cobalt mines paint a picture of systematic exploitation that extends far beyond isolated incidents. As of March 2024, 5,346 children in Lualaba and Haut-Katanga provinces were registered in the CLMRS database, the Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System established by the U.S. Department of Labor. However, this represents only the children who have been identified and registered. The actual number working in cobalt mines is believed to be significantly higher. The age profile of child laborers in cobalt mines is particularly disturbing. While international labor standards prohibit the employment of children under 18 in hazardous occupations, surveys consistently find children as young as 6 years old working in cobalt mines. Muntosh, 12, was aged about 6 when he witnessed his brother being killed while working in a cobalt mine. These youngest workers are often assigned tasks like washing and sorting cobalt ore, but even these safer activities expose them to toxic dust and chemicals. The drivers of child labor in the cobalt sector are complex and interconnected. Extreme poverty forces families to rely on children's income for basic survival. Older children in the DRC tend to work to pay for their education, while the younger primary school-aged children in the mines are forced to drop out of school completely. This creates a vicious cycle where children sacrifice their education and their future opportunities to meet immediate economic needs. The gender dynamics of child labor in cobalt mining reflect broader patterns of inequality in Congolese society. While boys are more likely to work directly in the mines, girls often work in ancillary activities like carrying ore, preparing food for miners, or engaging in transactional relationships with adult miners. These activities expose girls to different but equally serious risks, including sexual exploitation and early pregnancy. Recent efforts to address child labor have shown some progress but also highlighted the scale of the challenge. By December 2024, the project had successfully extricated over 9,016 children from artisanal cobalt mines and reintegrated them into schools or vocational training programs. While this represents significant progress, it also demonstrates that child labor remains a massive issue requiring sustained attention and resources. The health crisis, physical and psychological impacts on young bodies. The health impacts of cobalt mining on children are both immediate and long-lasting, affecting every aspect of their physical and psychological development. Cobalt dust, the most obvious health hazard, can cause severe respiratory problems, including what medical professionals call hard metal lung disease. This condition involves scarring of lung tissue that can lead to permanent breathing difficulties and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. Children working in cobalt mines are exposed to dangerous levels of cobalt dust throughout their workday. Unlike adult miners who may have access to basic protective equipment, children typically work without any safety gear. Their smaller bodies and developing respiratory systems make them particularly vulnerable to dust inhalation. The fine particles of cobalt ore can penetrate deep into lung tissue, causing inflammation that can persist long after exposure ends. Beyond respiratory issues, cobalt exposure can affect the cardiovascular system, causing heart problems that may not manifest until adulthood. Studies have documented cases of cobalt-induced cardiomyopathy among miners, a condition where the heart muscle becomes weakened and enlarged. For children whose cardiovascular systems are still developing, such exposure can have lifelong consequences that may not become apparent for decades. The psychological trauma associated with cobalt mining creates another layer of health impacts that are often overlooked in discussions focused on physical safety. Working in and around mines has a direct negative impact on children's health and safety, as well as depriving children of their right to development, protection, and education. Children working in mines witness accidents, injuries, and sometimes deaths of fellow workers. They work in constant fear of tunnel collapses, equipment failures, and violence from mine supervisors or security forces. The social isolation experienced by child miners compounds their psychological distress. Missing school means losing connection with peers and missing crucial developmental experiences that occur in educational settings. Many child miners report feelings of shame and hopelessness about their situation, recognizing that their current circumstances likely condemn them to a lifetime of poverty and dangerous work. Malnutrition exacerbates all these health problems. Children working in mines often lack access to adequate food, both because their families cannot afford proper nutrition and because mining work leaves little time for regular meals. Malnourished children are more susceptible to illness, recover more slowly from injuries, and experience delayed cognitive development that can affect their ability to learn and succeed if they eventually return to school. The global supply chain, tracing cobalt from mine to market. Understanding how cobalt travels from the mines of the DRC to the devices in our pockets requires following a complex global supply chain that deliberately obscures its origins through multiple intermediaries and processing stages. This opacity is not accidental. It serves the interests of companies that prefer not to examine too closely the conditions under which their raw materials are produced. The journey begins in the artisanal mines, where children and adults extract cobalt ore using basic hand tools. This ore is then sold to local traders who consolidate it with material from other small-scale operations. These traders, in turn, sell to larger intermediaries who process the ore into cobalt hydroxide or other semi-refined products. At each stage, cobalt from different sources, including material extracted using child labor, becomes mixed together, making it nearly impossible to trace the final product back to specific mines. Glencore supplies cobalt directly to global tech giants like Microsoft, Google, Tesla, and Apple, making it the largest cobalt supplier among foreign mining companies in the region. However, even major mining companies like Glencore, which operate large-scale industrial mines with better safety standards, often purchase additional cobalt from artisanal sources to meet their supply commitments. This practice, known as topping up, means that even supposedly responsible suppliers may inadvertently include material produced using child labor. Chinese companies dominate the middle stages of the cobalt supply chain, controlling much of the processing and refining capacity that transforms raw cobalt into the chemical compounds needed for battery production. Companies like CMOX, China Molybdenum, have become major players in Congolese cobalt production, while Chinese refiners process the majority of the world's cobalt, regardless of where it was originally mined. The final stages of the supply chain involve battery manufacturers who purchase refined cobalt chemicals and incorporate them into lithium-ion batteries. These batteries are then sold to electronics manufacturers, automotive companies, and other end users. At each stage, the connection to the original mining conditions becomes more distant and abstract, allowing companies to maintain plausible deniability about the working conditions in their supply chains. Major technology companies have implemented various programs aimed at ensuring responsible sourcing of cobalt, but these efforts face significant practical challenges. Supply chain audits are expensive and logistically complex, particularly in remote areas of the DRC where many artisanal mines are located. Even when audits are conducted, they often provide only a snapshot of conditions at a particular moment and may not detect child labor that occurs intermittently or outside normal working hours. Corporate responsibility and the limits of self-regulation. The technology industry's response to revelations about child labor in cobalt mining has evolved significantly over the past decade, but remains marked by a tension between public commitments to responsible sourcing and the practical challenges of transforming complex global supply chains. This evolution reflects broader changes in corporate social responsibility expectations and the increasing scrutiny that multinational corporations face regarding their supply chain practices. Apple, one of the world's largest technology companies, has implemented what it describes as one of the industry's most comprehensive responsible sourcing programs. The company conducts detailed audits of its suppliers, requires them to map their supply chains back to the mine level, and has invested in programs aimed at improving conditions in artisanal mining communities. However, critics argue that these efforts, while well-intentioned, are insufficient given the scale of the problem and the structural factors that drive child labor in the DRC. Tesla and other electric vehicle manufacturers face particular scrutiny because their products are marketed as environmentally and socially responsible alternatives to conventional vehicles. The irony that these clean technologies may depend on exploitative labor practices has not been lost on activists and consumers. Tesla has committed to eliminating cobalt from its battery chemistry entirely, But this transition will take years and may not be feasible for all applications. The limitations of corporate self-regulation become apparent when examining the practical challenges companies face in monitoring their cobalt supply chains. The DRC's artisanal mining sector is characterized by informality, with thousands of small-scale operations that appear and disappear based on market conditions and ore availability. Many of these sites are located in remote areas with limited infrastructure and weak governance institutions. Under these conditions, traditional corporate monitoring approaches, which typically involve periodic audits of formal business facilities, are largely ineffective. Furthermore, the economic incentives in the cobalt market often work against responsible sourcing efforts. Cobalt from artisanal sources is typically cheaper than material from large-scale industrial mines, creating pressure throughout the supply chain to source from lower-cost providers. Companies that invest in more expensive, responsibly sourced cobalt may find themselves at a competitive disadvantage compared to competitors who are less scrupulous about their sourcing practices. The concept of conflict minerals, originally developed to address the use of mineral revenues to fund armed conflicts, has been extended to cobalt as a way of addressing labor and environmental concerns. However, unlike traditional conflict minerals regulations that focus on specific geographic regions affected by armed conflict, cobalt presents a more complex challenge because the entire global supply depends heavily on a single country with widespread governance challenges. Government responses, policy enforcement, and political reality. The Democratic Republic of Congo's government faces a complex balancing act in addressing child labor in cobalt mining while maintaining the country's position as the world's dominant cobalt supplier. This challenge reflects broader tensions in Congolese politics between the need for foreign investment to drive economic development and the imperative to protect vulnerable populations, particularly children. President Felix Tshisekedi's administration has taken some steps to address child labor in mining, including the establishment of the Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System, CLMRS, in partnership with international organizations. The government piloted the Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System in 10 artisanal cobalt mining sites, and as of December 2023, 5,346 children were registered in the database and are being assessed for services. However, critics argue that these efforts remain insufficient given the scale of the problem and the limited resources allocated to enforcement. The Congolese government's approach to artisanal mining reflects competing priorities and interests. On one hand, artisanal mining provides livelihoods for hundreds of thousands of Congolese and represents an important source of foreign exchange earnings. On the other hand, the informal nature of much artisanal mining makes it difficult to regulate and creates conditions conducive to exploitation. Government efforts to formalize the artisanal mining sector have had mixed results, with many miners resistant to regulations that they perceive as increasing costs and reducing their already meager incomes. Corruption represents a significant obstacle to effective enforcement of child labor laws in the mining sector. Local officials responsible for monitoring mining activities often have financial interests in maintaining the status quo, whether through direct involvement in mining operations or through informal payments from mining operators. This creates a situation where laws prohibiting child labor exist on paper but are rarely enforced in practice. International pressure has played an important role in pushing the Congolese government to address child labor in mining, but this pressure also creates its own complications. External demands for action on child labor can be perceived as neo-colonial interference in Congolese affairs, particularly when they come from countries and companies that benefit from cheap cobalt while bearing none of the social costs of extraction. This dynamic can make it politically difficult for Congolese leaders to implement reforms, even when they recognize the need for change. The involvement of international organizations like UNICEF and the International Labour Organization, ILO, has provided technical expertise and funding for programs aimed at addressing child labor. But these interventions face sustainability challenges. International programs typically operate for defined periods with specific budgets, while the structural factors that drive child labor, poverty, lack of educational opportunities, weak governance institutions, require long-term, sustained attention. Environmental degradation, the ecological cost of cobalt extraction. The environmental impacts of cobalt mining in the DRC extend far beyond the immediate mining sites, creating a legacy of ecological degradation that will persist for generations. These environmental consequences are particularly troubling because they disproportionately affect the same communities that bear the social costs of mining, creating a double burden of exploitation. Artisanal cobalt mining involves extensive surface excavation that destroys local ecosystems and agricultural land. Unlike large-scale industrial mining operations that are required to conduct environmental impact assessments and implement rehabilitation plans, artisanal mining occurs with minimal environmental oversight. Miners dig wherever they find promising ore deposits, often on agricultural land or in ecologically sensitive areas. The use of mercury and other toxic chemicals in cobalt processing creates serious contamination risks for soil and water resources. While mercury is more commonly associated with gold mining, some artisanal cobalt operations use mercury amalgamation to concentrate cobalt ore. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin that bioaccumulates in food chains and can cause severe health problems, particularly in children. Even small amounts of mercury contamination can render water sources unsafe for drinking or agricultural use. Water pollution represents one of the most serious environmental consequences of cobalt mining. Mining operations generate large quantities of wastewater containing heavy metals, acids, and other contaminants. This wastewater often flows untreated into streams and rivers that serve as sources of drinking water and irrigation for downstream communities. The contamination can persist for decades, even after mining activities cease. Deforestation associated with mining operations contributes to broader environmental degradation in the region. Trees are cut down to provide fuel for processing operations and to clear land for mining activities. This deforestation reduces biodiversity, contributes to soil erosion, and eliminates carbon sequestration capacity at a time when climate change makes forest conservation increasingly important. The environmental costs of cobalt mining create additional hardships for communities already struggling with poverty and lack of economic opportunities. Agricultural land contaminated by mining activities cannot support food production, forcing families to purchase food they previously grew themselves. Contaminated water sources require communities to travel longer distances to find clean water or to purchase expensive bottled water. These additional costs further impoverish already vulnerable populations. The paradox of green technology, clean energy's dirty secret. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the cobalt mining crisis is its intimate connection to technologies that are promoted as solutions to environmental and climate problems. Electric vehicles, renewable energy storage systems, and energy-efficient electronics all depend on lithium-ion batteries that require cobalt. This creates a fundamental paradox. The technologies we need to address climate change may themselves depend on exploitative and environmentally destructive practices. The electric vehicle industry exemplifies this paradox. Electric vehicles produce no direct emissions during operation and can significantly reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions when powered by clean electricity. However, the batteries that make these vehicles possible require cobalt that is often extracted under conditions that violate basic human rights and environmental standards. This contradiction forces consumers and policymakers to confront uncomfortable questions about the true sustainability of clean energy technologies. The renewable energy sector faces similar challenges. Large-scale deployment of wind and solar power requires massive battery storage systems to manage the intermittent nature of renewable energy sources. These storage systems rely on the same lithium-ion battery technology used in electric vehicles, creating additional demand for cobalt. As governments around the world implement ambitious renewable energy targets, this demand is likely to increase significantly. Some companies and researchers are working to develop cobalt-free battery technologies, but these alternatives face significant technical and economic challenges. Cobalt plays a crucial role in battery stability and energy density, and removing it often requires trade-offs in terms of performance, safety, or cost. While progress is being made in developing alternative battery chemistries, the transition away from cobalt is likely to take many years. The time lag between current cobalt demand and the availability of alternative technologies creates an ethical dilemma for consumers and companies. Should we delay the deployment of clean energy technologies until more ethical supply chains can be established? Or should we proceed with current technologies while working to improve their supply chains over time? There are reasonable arguments on both sides of this debate, but the urgency of addressing climate change often tilts the balance toward accepting current supply chain problems as a necessary evil. International law and enforcement challenges. The international legal framework governing child labor and forced labor in global supply chains has evolved significantly in recent years, but enforcement remains a major challenge. Various international conventions, national laws, and trade agreements now include provisions aimed at preventing the importation of goods produced using child or forced labor. But translating these legal frameworks into effective action has proven difficult. EU law expressly prohibits child labor and the importing of products made with forced labor, and the European Union has been developing new legislation to strengthen supply chain due diligence requirements. However, implementing these laws effectively requires companies to trace complex supply chains that often involve multiple countries and numerous intermediaries. The technical challenges of supply chain mapping are compounded by the economic incentives for companies to maintain plausible deniability about their sourcing practices. The United States has also strengthened its legal framework for addressing forced labor in global supply chains. The Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits the importation of goods produced using forced labor, and recent enforcement actions have targeted products from various sectors and countries. However, applying these laws to complex supply chains like those for cobalt requires sophisticated investigative capabilities and significant resources for enforcement agencies. International organizations like the International Labour Organization, ILO, provide important normative frameworks and technical assistance for addressing child labor, but they lack direct enforcement powers. The ILO's conventions on child labor establish international standards, but compliance depends on the willingness and capacity of national governments to implement and enforce these standards. In countries with weak governance institutions and limited resources, this approach has significant limitations. The challenge of jurisdiction further complicates international legal responses to child labor in cobalt mining. While the labor violations occur in the DRC, the companies that ultimately benefit from this labor are located in many different countries with different legal systems. Creating accountability across these jurisdictional boundaries requires either strong international cooperation or the willingness of companies' home countries to assert extraterritorial jurisdiction over their corporations' supply chain practices. Technological solutions and innovation. As awareness of child labor in cobalt supply chains has grown, various technological solutions have been proposed to improve transparency and traceability. These technologies range from blockchain-based tracking systems to satellite monitoring of mining sites. But each faces significant practical challenges in the complex environment of DRC's mining sector. Blockchain technology has attracted attention as a potential solution for supply chain traceability, because it can create tamper-proof records of transactions and ownership transfers. Several companies have piloted blockchain systems for tracking cobalt from mines to end users, with the goal of ensuring that only responsibly sourced material enters clean supply chains. However, these systems face the fundamental challenge that they can only track material that is formally part of the recorded supply chain. Cobalt from artisanal mines often enters the supply chain through informal networks that operate outside any tracking system. Satellite monitoring and remote sensing technologies offer another approach to monitoring mining activities and detecting potential labor violations. High-resolution satellite imagery can identify new mining sites, track changes in mining activity levels, and potentially detect evidence of large-scale operations that might involve child labor. However, many instances of child labor occur at small-scale sites that are difficult to detect from satellite imagery, and satellite data cannot directly identify the age of workers. Chemical fingerprinting represents a more technical approach to supply chain traceability. Different cobalt deposits have unique chemical signatures that can potentially be detected in finished products, allowing investigators to trace cobalt back to specific mining regions or even individual mines. This technology has shown promise in laboratory settings, but scaling it up for commercial use would require significant investment and cooperation from companies throughout the supply chain. Mobile technology and digital platforms have shown some promise for improving conditions in artisanal mining communities. Mobile payment systems can help ensure that miners receive fair payment for their materials, while digital platforms can connect miners directly with buyers, potentially reducing the role of exploitative intermediaries. However, these technologies require infrastructure and digital literacy that may not be available in remote mining communities. Community-based solutions and local initiatives. Some of the most promising approaches to addressing child labor in cobalt mining have come from community-based initiatives that work directly with affected families and mining communities. These programs recognize that child labor is often a symptom of broader poverty and lack of opportunity, and they attempt to address root causes rather than simply removing children from mining sites. Children working in some of the Democratic Republic of Congo's DRC cobalt mines are getting support to trade their tools for textbooks to escape from dangerous and even fatal worker exploitation, Save the Children said on World Day. Programs like Save the Children's catch-up clubs provide educational opportunities for children who have missed school due to work in mines. These programs use accelerated learning techniques to help children catch up academically, while also providing psychosocial support to address trauma from mining work. Income diversification programs represent another community-based approach that aims to reduce families' dependence on mining income. These programs provide training and microfinance for alternative economic activities like agriculture, small-scale manufacturing, or service provision. By creating alternative sources of income, these programs can reduce the economic pressure that drives families to send children into mines. Women's empowerment initiatives have shown particular promise because women often play crucial roles in household decision-making about children's education and work. Programs that provide economic opportunities for women, such as cooperative businesses or skills training, can strengthen families' economic position and reduce the need for child labor. Women who have stable incomes are more likely to prioritize their children's education over short-term economic contributions from child labor. Community education programs work to raise awareness about the rights of children and the importance of education. These programs often use culturally appropriate methods like community theater, storytelling, and peer education to communicate messages about child protection. By changing community attitudes toward child labor, these programs can create social pressure for families to keep children in school rather than sending them to work in mines. The involvement of traditional leaders and religious authorities has proven crucial for the success of community-based programs. These respected community figures can provide legitimacy for child protection messages and can help mediate conflicts that arise when families are asked to change long-standing practices related to children's work and education. The role of education, breaking the cycle. Education represents both a key factor in perpetuating child labor in cobalt mining and the most promising avenue for breaking the cycle of exploitation. For people in southeastern DRC, income opportunities are few and access to good quality education is low. The lack of accessible, quality education creates conditions where families see little alternative to child labor, while the presence of good educational opportunities can provide pathways out of poverty that make child labor unnecessary. The educational landscape in southeastern DRC reflects broader challenges in the country's education system. Schools are often far from mining communities, requiring children to walk long distances or live away from their families. Many schools lack basic infrastructure like buildings, furniture, and learning materials. Teacher training and compensation are inadequate, leading to high teacher turnover and poor quality instruction. The cost of education, even for supposedly free primary schooling, creates additional barriers for mining families. Parents must often pay for uniforms, books, supplies, and various school fees that can represent a significant portion of family income. For families living in extreme poverty, the opportunity cost of sending children to school, foregoing the income they could earn from mining work, can be prohibitive. Language barriers compound educational challenges in mining communities. Instruction is typically provided in French or official local languages, but many children in remote mining areas speak only local dialects. This linguistic mismatch can make it difficult for children to succeed in school, leading to high dropout rates and reinforcing the perception that education is not a viable pathway for children from mining families. However, when educational opportunities are made accessible and relevant to local conditions, they can dramatically reduce child labor in mining. Programs that provide flexible school schedules, local language instruction, and direct support for educational costs have shown success in getting children out of mines and into classrooms. Vocational training programs that teach relevant skills for local economic opportunities can provide pathways to employment that does not depend on mining. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted both the vulnerability of education systems in mining regions and the importance of innovative approaches to education delivery. School closures during the pandemic pushed many children back into mining work, but some communities developed alternative education delivery methods, including radio-based lessons and community learning centers, that proved resilient to disruption. Health and safety in artisanal mining. The health and safety conditions in artisanal cobalt mines represent some of the most dangerous working environments in the world, and these dangers are magnified for children whose developing bodies are more vulnerable to injury and toxic exposure. Understanding these risks is crucial for developing effective interventions to protect children and adult miners alike. Physical injuries are common in artisanal mining operations that lack basic safety equipment and procedures. Mine collapses represent the most serious immediate danger, as artisanal mines are often dug without proper support structures or geological assessment. These collapses can bury miners alive or cause crushing injuries that are often fatal given the limited medical care available in remote mining areas. Chemical exposure represents a more insidious but equally serious health risk. Cobalt ore processing often involves the use of acids and other chemicals that can cause skin burns, respiratory damage, and long-term health problems. Children working in processing areas are exposed to these chemicals without protective equipment, often while handling materials with bare hands. The lack of medical care in mining communities compounds the health risks associated with mining work. When injuries or illnesses occur, miners often cannot access appropriate medical treatment due to distance, cost, or lack of medical facilities. This means that conditions that could be easily treated in other contexts can become life-threatening in mining communities. Occupational health monitoring, which is standard practice in formal mining operations, is almost entirely absent in artisanal mining. This means that health problems related to long-term exposure to mining hazards often go undetected until they become severe. By the time miners develop obvious symptoms of occupational illness, the damage may be irreversible. Some organizations have begun implementing basic health and safety training programs for artisanal mining communities. These programs teach miners to recognize hazards, use basic protective equipment, and implement simple safety procedures that can reduce injury rates. However, the effectiveness of these programs is limited by the economic pressures that drive miners to prioritize short-term income over long-term health and safety. Economic alternatives and livelihood diversification. Addressing child labor in cobalt mining ultimately requires creating economic alternatives that can provide families with sustainable livelihoods that do not depend on dangerous mining work. This challenge is complicated by the limited economic opportunities available in southeastern DRC and the immediate income needs of families living in extreme poverty. Agriculture represents the most obvious alternative to mining for many families in the region. The southeastern DRC has favorable conditions for various crops, and many mining families maintain small agricultural plots alongside their mining activities. However, agriculture faces significant challenges, including limited access to improved seeds and fertilizers, lack of transportation infrastructure to reach markets, and competition from food imports. Small-scale manufacturing and processing activities represent another potential source of alternative employment. These could include food processing, textile production, or the manufacture of basic goods for local markets. However, developing these industries requires access to capital, technical training, and market connections that are often lacking in mining communities. Service sector employment, including education, healthcare, and retail, could provide additional economic opportunities, but the demand for these services is limited in communities with low incomes. As mining communities develop economically, demand for services typically increases. But this creates a chicken and egg problem where service sector development depends on broader economic growth. The development of value-added activities within the mining sector itself represents another approach to livelihood diversification. Rather than simply extracting raw ore, mining communities could potentially engage in preliminary processing, equipment manufacturing, or support services for mining operations. However, this approach requires significant investment in equipment and training, and it does not address the fundamental health and safety problems associated with mining work. Microfinance and small business development programs have shown some success in providing alternative economic opportunities for mining families. These programs provide small loans and business training to help individuals start non-mining businesses. However, the success of these programs depends on the existence of viable market opportunities, which may be limited in remote mining communities. International market dynamics and price pressures. The global cobalt market operates according to economic logic that often works against efforts to improve labor conditions in DRC mines. Understanding these market dynamics is crucial for developing effective policies to address child labor and other problems in cobalt supply chains. Cobalt prices are highly volatile, responding to changes in supply and demand that are often unrelated to conditions in producing regions. When cobalt prices are high, mining activity intensifies, potentially drawing more children into mining work as families seek to capitalize on favorable market conditions. When prices are low, mining families may face increased economic pressure, making it even more difficult to keep children out of mines. The structure of global demand for cobalt is increasingly dominated by the battery industry, which now accounts for more than half of global cobalt consumption. This demand is projected to grow rapidly as electric vehicle production scales up and renewable energy deployment accelerates. However, this growing demand has not necessarily translated into better conditions for miners in the DRC. Chinese companies dominate cobalt processing and refining, giving China significant influence over global cobalt markets. This concentration of processing capacity creates dependencies that affect pricing, supply security, and the leverage available to producing countries like the DRC. Chinese companies' business practices and labor standards in their DRC operations have important implications for working conditions throughout the sector. The development of cobalt alternatives, including different battery chemistries that use less cobalt or no cobalt at all, could potentially reduce pressure on DRC supplies. However, these technological transitions typically take many years, and some applications may continue to require cobalt for the foreseeable future. The uncertainty about future demand creates additional volatility that affects investment decisions and working conditions in the DRC. Consumer awareness and corporate social responsibility initiatives have created some market pressure for responsibly sourced cobalt, but this has not yet translated into significant price premiums for certified responsible cobalt. Without clear economic incentives for responsible sourcing, market forces often favor lower-cost suppliers regardless of their labor practices. Looking forward, pathways to change. Despite the daunting challenges outlined in this analysis, there are reasons for cautious optimism about the possibility of improving conditions in DRC's cobalt mining sector. Progress will require sustained effort from multiple stakeholders, including governments, companies, civil society organizations, and international institutions. But several promising developments suggest that change is possible. Technological innovation in battery chemistry may eventually reduce dependence on cobalt, though this transition will take time and may not eliminate cobalt demand entirely. Companies like Tesla are investing heavily in cobalt-free battery technologies, and researchers are making progress in developing alternative materials that can provide similar performance characteristics. While these technologies are not yet ready for widespread commercial deployment, they offer hope for reducing long-term pressure on cobalt supplies. Strengthened international legal frameworks for supply chain due diligence are creating new obligations for companies to monitor and address labor conditions in their supply chains. The European Union's planned supply chain due diligence legislation and similar initiatives in other jurisdictions will require companies to take more active steps to prevent child labor in their supply chains. While enforcement will remain challenging, these legal requirements create important accountability mechanisms. Improved governance and institutional capacity in the DRC itself represents perhaps the most important factor for long-term change. Recent political developments, including the election of President Félix Tshisekedi in 2019, have created some opportunities for reform, though progress has been slow and uneven. Building effective institutions that can regulate mining activities, enforce labor laws, and provide essential services to mining communities will require sustained political commitment and significant international support. The growing involvement of international organizations and civil society groups in addressing cobalt mining issues has increased pressure for change and provided resources for intervention programs. Organizations like Save the Children, UNICEF, and the International Labour Organization have developed expertise in addressing child labor in mining contexts and have demonstrated that effective interventions are possible when adequate resources are available. Perhaps most importantly, the voices of affected communities are increasingly being heard in discussions about cobalt mining. Local organizations, community leaders, and even child laborers themselves are becoming more effective advocates for change. Their first-hand knowledge of conditions in mining communities and their proposed solutions deserve greater attention from policymakers and corporate decision-makers. The path forward. Recommendations for action. Creating meaningful change in DRC's cobalt mining sector will require coordinated action across multiple levels and sectors. While no single intervention can solve all the problems associated with cobalt mining. A comprehensive approach that addresses both immediate harms and underlying structural issues offers the best hope for progress. For governments and policymakers, the DRC government should strengthen enforcement of existing child labor laws, while simultaneously investing in the social services and economic opportunities that can provide alternatives to mining for vulnerable families. This includes expanding access to quality education, improving healthcare systems, and supporting economic diversification initiatives in mining communities. Consumer country governments should strengthen supply chain due diligence requirements and provide technical and financial support for responsible sourcing initiatives. This could include funding for supply chain traceability systems, support for alternative livelihood programs in mining communities, and assistance for governance capacity building in the DRC. For companies and industry, technology companies should increase investment in cobalt-free battery technologies while simultaneously improving the labor conditions in their existing supply chains. This requires going beyond superficial auditing to support comprehensive programs that address the root causes of child labor in mining communities. Companies should also support industry-wide initiatives for responsible sourcing rather than relying solely on individual corporate programs. Collective action can achieve scale and impact that individual company efforts cannot match, and it can help level the playing field by ensuring that responsible companies are not disadvantaged by competitors who cut costs through exploitation. For international organizations and civil society, international organizations should continue developing and scaling programs that provide alternatives to child labor while addressing the underlying drivers of exploitation. This includes education programs, alternative livelihood initiatives, and advocacy for policy changes that protect children's rights. Civil society organizations should maintain pressure on companies and governments to take meaningful action while continuing to amplify the voices of affected communities. International advocacy can help ensure that the experiences and perspectives of mining communities are heard in corporate boardrooms and government ministries around the world. For consumers and citizens, individual consumers can contribute to change by supporting companies that demonstrate genuine commitment to responsible sourcing and by advocating for stronger government action on supply chain issues. While consumer choice alone cannot solve the cobalt crisis, informed consumer demand can contribute to market pressure for change. Citizens can also support their governments in providing international development assistance that addresses the structural factors driving child labor, including poverty, lack of education, and weak governance institutions. Conclusion: the true cost of our connected world. The story of cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our modern world. The technologies that connect us, transport us, and power our transition to clean energy often depend on the exploitation of some of the world's most vulnerable people. Every smartphone in our pocket, every electric vehicle on our roads, and every renewable energy battery storing clean electricity contains materials that may have been extracted by children working in dangerous conditions for less than $2 per day. This is not an inevitable consequence of technological progress, but rather a result of economic and political systems that allow the costs of extraction to be imposed on vulnerable communities, while the benefits flow to wealthy consumers and profitable corporations. The persistence of child labor in cobalt mining reflects broader patterns of global inequality that have deep historical roots but are continuously reproduced through contemporary economic relationships. Yet the story of cobalt mining also demonstrates the possibility of change when sufficient attention, resources, and political will are directed toward addressing exploitation and injustice. The thousands of children who have been removed from mines and enrolled in schools through international programs show that alternatives are possible. The companies that have invested in responsible sourcing initiatives demonstrate that different business models can succeed. The communities that have developed alternative economic activities prove that mining is not the only path to development. The challenge moving forward is to scale up these positive examples while addressing the structural factors that continue to drive child labor in mining. This will require sustained commitment from all stakeholders: governments, companies, international organizations, and civil society, and a willingness to accept higher costs and reduced profits in exchange for more just and sustainable supply chains. The children currently working in cobalt mines cannot wait for perfect solutions or technological breakthroughs that may take decades to implement. They need immediate action to protect their health, safety, and futures. At the same time, lasting change requires addressing the deeper issues of poverty, inequality, and weak governance that make families vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. As we continue to depend on cobalt and other critical minerals for our modern technologies, we must ensure that the true costs of extraction are not hidden from view or imposed on those least able to bear them. The price of our connected world should not be paid by children laboring in dangerous mines, but rather shared fairly among all who benefit from these technologies. The cobalt mining crisis is ultimately a test of our values and priorities as a global community. Will we accept exploitation and suffering as the price of technological progress, or will we insist that human dignity and rights are non-negotiable? The answer to this question will shape not only the future of mining in the DRC, but also our broader relationship with the natural world and with each other in an increasingly interconnected global economy. The true measure of our technological civilization will not be the sophistication of our devices or the efficiency of our clean energy systems, but rather our ability to ensure that the benefits of progress are shared justly and that no child is forced to sacrifice their health, education, and future for the convenience of others. The story of cobalt mining in the DRC reminds us that this goal, while challenging, remains both necessary and achievable if we have the courage and commitment to pursue it.